Elvis was born with a twin brother who died at birth, but his obsession with that lost twin shaped every decision he made for 42 years and ultimately led to his tragic death. The psychological trauma of being a surviving twin created a darkness in Elvis that no one fully understood until it was too late. On January 8, 1935, in a small two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, Gladys Presley gave birth to twin boys in what should have been one of the happiest moments of her life. Instead, it became a tragedy that would haunt the Presley family forever. The first baby, Jesse Garon Presley, was born stillborn after a difficult labor that had lasted over 18 hours. 35 minutes later, Elvis Aaron Presley entered the world, alive but forever marked by the loss of his twin brother who had shared the womb with him for 9 months. The death of Jesse Garon was devastating for Vernon and Gladys Presley, who had been struggling financially and had hoped that having children would bring joy and purpose to their difficult lives. The stillbirth of one twin while the other survived created a complex mix of grief and gratitude that the family never fully processed or recovered from. Gladys, in particular, was consumed by guilt and sorrow, constantly wondering what she could have done differently to save both babies, and frequently expressing the belief that Jesse's death was somehow her fault. From his earliest childhood, Elvis was acutely aware that he was supposed to have been part of a pair, and this knowledge created a profound sense of incompleteness that would influence every aspect of his personality and behavior. Gladys frequently told Elvis stories about Jesse, describing how the two boys would have been best friends and how they would have shared everything together. These stories, while intended to honor Jesse's memory, created in Elvis's mind a vivid image of the brother he had never known and a deep sense of loss for the companionship that had been taken from him before birth. If this incredible story of twin survivor trauma and its devastating psychological impact has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The obsession with his dead twin brother would drive Elvis to behaviors and decisions that ultimately destroyed his ability to find peace and happiness in his remarkable life. The psychological concept of vanishing twin syndrome was not well understood in the 1930s, but modern research has shown that survivors of twin loss often experience profound psychological effects that can last throughout their lives. These effects include an inexplicable sense of loneliness, difficulty forming complete relationships with others, and a persistent feeling that something essential is missing from their lives. Elvis exhibited all of these symptoms from early childhood, displaying behaviors that his family attributed to his sensitive nature, but which were actually manifestations of the trauma of twin loss. As Elvis grew from a toddler into a young child, his connection to his deceased twin brother Jesse became more intense and complex, evolving from simple awareness of loss into what appeared to be an ongoing relationship with an imaginary companion. Elvis would frequently be found talking to someone who wasn't there, carrying on detailed conversations that his parents initially dismissed as normal childhood behavior, but which became increasingly concerning as Elvis got older and the conversations became more elaborate and emotionally charged. Gladys Presley began to notice that Elvis seemed to consult with his invisible companion before making important decisions, often pausing in the middle of activities to have whispered conversations that appeared to be seeking advice or permission from Jesse. These behaviors were particularly pronounced during moments of stress or uncertainty, when Elvis seemed to draw comfort and guidance from his connection to his twin brother's spirit. The intensity of these interactions worried Gladys, but she was reluctant to interfere because they seemed to provide Elvis with emotional support that she felt unable to give him herself. The relationship between Elvis and his imagined twin became more structured as Elvis entered school and began to interact with other children. Elvis would often speak about Jesse as if he were a real person, telling classmates and teachers about his brother who lived with the family but whom others couldn't see. These stories created confusion and concern among adults who weren't sure how to respond to Elvis's insistence that Jesse was present and actively involved in his daily life. Some teachers recommended that the family seek professional help, but the Presleys lacked the resources for psychological counseling and were unsure whether Elvis's behavior represented a serious problem or simply an unusually vivid imagination. Elvis's connection to Jesse also manifested in his early musical development, as he would often perform for his invisible twin, singing songs and playing instruments as if Jesse were his audience and accompanist. Elvis claimed that Jesse helped him choose which songs to sing and would provide feedback on his performances, creating a collaborative relationship that Elvis valued more highly than praise from living family members and friends. This musical partnership with his deceased twin became the foundation for Elvis's artistic development and may have contributed to the unique emotional depth and vulnerability that characterized his performing style. The psychological dependence on Jesse's imagined presence created challenges for Elvis in forming relationships with living children and adults. He often seemed more comfortable interacting with his invisible twin than with real people, and he would sometimes become upset or withdrawn when others couldn't see or interact with Jesse in the way that Elvis expected them to. This social isolation reinforced Elvis's bond with his imaginary twin and made it even more difficult for him to develop the interpersonal skills that would have helped him navigate relationships throughout his life. As Elvis entered adolescence and his musical talents began to attract attention, his relationship with his deceased twin brother Jesse evolved from an imaginary companion into a source of profound guilt and overwhelming responsibility. Elvis began to believe that he was living not just his own life, but also the life that Jesse would have lived if he had survived, and this belief created an impossible pressure to achieve enough success and happiness for two people instead of one. The weight of this responsibility became apparent in Elvis's approach to his musical career as he threw himself into performing with an intensity and dedication that went far beyond normal ambition or artistic passion. Elvis seemed driven by a desperate need to justify his survival by achieving extraordinary success, as if he could somehow make Jesse's death meaningful by accomplishing enough for both of them. This pressure contributed to Elvis's relentless work ethic and his willingness to push himself beyond physical and emotional limits in pursuit of career goals that seemed to expand endlessly as his fame grew. Elvis's guilt about being the surviving twin also manifested in his relationships with family members, particularly his mother Gladys, whom he saw as having been cheated out of the joy of raising two sons. Elvis became obsessively devoted to Gladys, showering her with attention, gifts, and promises that seemed designed to compensate for the loss of Jesse's love and companionship. This intense mother-son relationship, while touching in its devotion, created an unhealthy dynamic that interfered with Elvis's ability to form mature romantic relationships and contributed to his difficulty in achieving emotional independence as an adult. The survivor's guilt that plagued Elvis also influenced his approach to money and success, as he felt compelled to share his wealth with others in ways that seemed designed to justify his good fortune. Elvis's famous generosity, while genuinely kind-hearted, often seemed driven by a need to prove that he deserved the life he had been given, as if giving away cars, houses, and money could somehow balance the cosmic scales that had allowed him to live while Jesse had died. This compulsive giving created financial pressures that would plague Elvis throughout his career and contributed to his dependence on others to manage his affairs. The psychological burden of living for two people became increasingly difficult for Elvis to bear as he achieved greater success and fame. The pressure to experience enough joy, love, and accomplishment for both himself and Jesse created an impossible standard that left Elvis feeling perpetually inadequate despite his extraordinary achievements. This sense of falling short of an impossible goal contributed to the depression and anxiety that would characterize much of Elvis's adult life and would eventually drive him to seek relief through prescription medications that would prove to be his downfall. Have you ever felt like you were living for someone else or carrying the weight of another person's unfulfilled dreams? What do you think it would be like to feel responsible for justifying your very existence through your achievements? As Elvis's fame and success reached unprecedented heights during the 1960s and early 1970s, his obsession with his deceased twin brother Jesse took on increasingly spiritual and mystical dimensions. Elvis began to explore various religious and philosophical traditions, searching for understanding about life, death, and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead. This spiritual seeking was driven largely by his desire to reconnect with Jesse and to understand the meaning of twin loss in the broader context of human existence and divine purpose. Elvis's interest in spirituality led him to study various religious texts, including the Bible, Eastern philosophy, and metaphysical teachings that promised insight into the nature of the soul and the afterlife. He became particularly fascinated by concepts of reincarnation, soul connections, and the idea that twins might share a single soul that had been divided between two bodies. These beliefs gave Elvis hope that his connection to Jesse might be more than just memory and imagination, and that his twin brother's consciousness might still exist in some form that could be accessed through spiritual practices. The spiritual dimension of Elvis's twin obsession was encouraged by several advisors and friends who were drawn to his wealth and fame and who exploited his vulnerability by claiming to have special knowledge about Jesse's spiritual presence. Larry Geller, Elvis's hairdresser who became his spiritual advisor, introduced him to various mystical practices and encouraged his belief that he could communicate with Jesse through meditation, prayer, and psychic experiences. While some of these spiritual explorations may have provided Elvis with genuine comfort, they also reinforced his unhealthy fixation on his deceased twin and prevented him from processing his grief in more constructive ways. Elvis's spiritual seeking also led him to experiment with altered states of consciousness through various means, including prescription medications that he believed might facilitate spiritual experiences and communication with the dead. This dangerous combination of psychological vulnerability and chemical experimentation created the conditions for the prescription drug dependency that would eventually kill him. Elvis justified his drug use as a spiritual practice rather than acknowledging it as a form of self-medication for psychological pain, making it even more difficult for friends and family members to intervene effectively. The mystical aspects of Elvis's twin obsession also influenced his approach to his music and performances, as he began to see his career as a spiritual mission that connected him to audiences in ways that transcended normal entertainment. Elvis believed that his ability to move people emotionally through his music was somehow connected to Jesse's spiritual presence, and that his performances were a form of channeling that allowed Jesse's essence to reach the world through Elvis's voice and body. This belief added a messianic dimension to Elvis's career that created additional pressure and contributed to his sense that he was responsible for healing and inspiring others in ways that went far beyond normal artistic expression. During his final years, Elvis's obsession with his deceased twin brother Jesse manifested in increasingly destructive rituals and behaviors that alarmed those closest to him and contributed directly to his physical and mental decline. These rituals, while intended to honor Jesse's memory and maintain their spiritual connection, became compulsive behaviors that consumed enormous amounts of Elvis's time and emotional energy, while providing no real comfort or resolution to his psychological pain. One of the most disturbing aspects of Elvis's twin obsession in his final years was his habit of conducting elaborate imaginary conversations with Jesse during the late-night hours when his insomnia was at its worst. Elvis would pace through Graceland for hours, speaking aloud to his deceased twin about his fears, his regrets, and his plans for the future, as if Jesse were physically present and actively participating in the discussions. These conversations often became emotionally charged, with Elvis alternately pleading for Jesse's forgiveness, seeking his advice, and expressing anger about being left alone to bear the burden of their shared destiny. Elvis also developed rituals around significant dates connected to Jesse's memory, including elaborate observances of their shared birthday that involved setting aside portions of food, gifts, and cake for his deceased twin. These birthday celebrations became increasingly elaborate and emotionally intense, with Elvis treating Jesse as if he were a living family member who deserved equal recognition and attention. The contrast between the joy that should have accompanied birthday celebrations and the grief that actually characterized these events was deeply disturbing to family members who witnessed Elvis's psychological deterioration. Perhaps most destructively, Elvis began to make major life decisions based on what he believed Jesse would have wanted or advised, even when those decisions were clearly harmful to his health, career, or relationships. Elvis would justify dangerous behaviors, excessive drug use, and destructive relationship choices by claiming that Jesse had endorsed or encouraged these actions during their spiritual communications. This pattern of using his twin obsession to rationalize self-destructive behavior made it virtually impossible for friends and family members to intervene effectively, since challenging Elvis's decisions meant challenging his relationship with Jesse. The final and most tragic aspect of Elvis's twin rituals was his growing belief that death would reunite him with Jesse and allow them to complete the life they were supposed to have lived together. This romanticization of death as a reunion with his twin brother made Elvis increasingly careless about his health and safety as he began to see his physical death as a spiritual homecoming rather than a tragic end to his remarkable life. The combination of this death wish with his prescription drug dependency created a lethal situation that his doctors and loved ones were unable to prevent. In the weeks before his death, Elvis's obsession with his twin brother Jesse reached its most intense and destructive peak, consuming virtually all of his mental and emotional energy while leaving him unable to focus on the practical matters that might have saved his life. The twin obsession that had shaped his entire existence finally overwhelmed his ability to function in the real world, creating a psychological crisis that contributed directly to the circumstances that led to his death on August 16, 1977. Elvis's final conversations with friends and family members were dominated by references to Jesse and discussions about their anticipated reunion and death. He spoke frequently about being tired of living alone and expressed a longing to be reunited with the twin brother who had been taken from him at birth. These statements alarmed those who heard them, but Elvis's history of dramatic and emotional expressions made it difficult for people to recognize that his talk of death had become more than artistic melancholy and had evolved into genuine suicidal ideation. The prescription drug combinations that Elvis was taking during his final weeks were increasingly influenced by his desire to achieve altered states of consciousness that he believed would facilitate communication with Jesse. Elvis had become convinced that certain drug combinations could thin the boundary between life and death, allowing him to experience temporary reunions with his deceased twin while still maintaining his hold on physical existence. This dangerous experimentation with consciousness-altering substances, justified by his twin obsession, created the perfect conditions for the accidental overdose that would ultimately kill him. Dr. George Nicopolis and other medical professionals who were treating Elvis during his final months recognized that his twin obsession had become a serious psychological problem that required professional intervention, but their attempts to address the issue were consistently rejected by Elvis, who saw any challenge to his relationship with Jesse as an attack on the most important relationship in his life. The failure to successfully treat Elvis's underlying psychological trauma meant that his self-destructive behaviors continued to escalate until they reached a fatal conclusion. The tragedy of Elvis's twin obsession is that what began as a natural response to loss and trauma became a psychological prison that prevented him from fully engaging with life and ultimately contributed to his premature death. The brother who had died at birth, who should have been mourned and then remembered with love, instead became a destructive force that consumed Elvis's capacity for happiness and growth. The obsession that was meant to honor Jesse's memory actually dishonored both brothers by preventing Elvis from living the full and meaningful life that would have been the best tribute to his twin's lost potential. What do you think about the way that unprocessed grief and trauma can shape an entire life? Have you ever known someone whose inability to let go of loss prevented them from embracing the opportunities that life offered them? The story of Elvis and Jesse Garon Presley serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of processing grief and trauma in healthy ways, rather than allowing loss to become an obsession that consumes one's ability to live fully in the present. Elvis's extraordinary talents and achievements were overshadowed by his inability to find peace with his twin brother's death, demonstrating that even the most successful and beloved individuals can be destroyed by unresolved psychological wounds. The psychological concept of survivor's guilt, while not well understood during Elvis's lifetime, provides important insight into the destructive patterns that characterized his adult life and relationships. The belief that he was living for two people instead of one created impossible pressures that no human being could sustain indefinitely, and the failure to recognize and treat this underlying trauma allowed it to fester and grow until it overwhelmed Elvis's ability to cope with the normal stresses of life and career. Elvis's twin obsession also highlights the importance of professional mental health care in addressing complex trauma and grief. The spiritual advisors and enablers who surrounded Elvis during his final years, while perhaps well-intentioned, lacked the training and expertise necessary to help him process his psychological wounds effectively. Their encouragement of his mystical beliefs about Jesse may have actually reinforced his unhealthy obsession and prevented him from seeking the professional help that might have saved his life. The legacy of Elvis's struggle with twin loss extends beyond his individual tragedy, to serve as an example of how childhood trauma can influence an entire lifetime if not properly addressed. The coping mechanisms that Elvis developed as a child to deal with his sense of incompleteness and loss became increasingly destructive as he grew older and faced more complex challenges, demonstrating the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood trauma and loss. This incredible story of how the loss of a twin brother shaped and ultimately destroyed one of America's greatest entertainers reminds us that success and fame cannot heal psychological wounds and that everyone, regardless of their achievements, deserves compassion and professional help when struggling with grief and trauma. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories about the hidden struggles of music's greatest legends. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that seeking help for psychological pain is a sign of strength, not weakness. And let us know in the comments, what do you think could have been done differently to help Elvis process his twin loss in healthier ways?